Today, as you know, is a day of transition. As the arrow here indicates, we're turning from the first to the second slice of our pie, moving in doing so from South to East Asia. If we take the pie and the arrow and superimpose them as we've done before on a map of the world, you can see more precisely the route that we're taking. As before, I've positioned the center of the pie, or the bullseye, up there at the northern tip of India. Actually, here's a better picture. This more focused regional map shows you the specific countries that we're actually talking about. We've been in India during our last several sessions together, but now we're on the move in a more or less northeasterly direction, climbing over the Himalaya mountains as we pass through Nepal and Tibet and Bhutan on our way to China. As you know from your reading in Paths of Return, this is more or less the route taken by the religion we're discussing today, as it transitioned from its birthplace in India, first to the north and east, but from there ultimately also to the southern side of East Asia. That religion, of course, is Buddhism. Here I give you just a few stats. As I point out on this slide, Buddhism has roughly 445 million adherents worldwide, or if you want to think about it this way, around 7% of the world's population. It's the fourth largest religion in the world, after Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. In that order, Christianity is the largest, Islam is the second, Hinduism the third, and now Buddhism. The greatest number of Buddhists are in China, about 175 million, and there are Buddhist majorities in Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, also known as Burma, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Japan further east, Laos, Southeast Asia. Just a quick word here before I turn to the next slide about the symbol in front of you. This is called the Dharma Chakra. That means the Dharma wheel. Dharma, as you may remember from our study of Hinduism, means, among other things, law. It can mean sacred teaching, and that's really more the meaning in this case. The wheel of the teaching, the wheel of the doctrine. The Buddha is said to have turned the wheel. That's the metaphor used in setting in motion the teachings for his particular age. The circle of the wheel also represents symbolically the cycle of death and rebirth. And if you've counted them here, you may have noticed there are 8 spokes with this wheel, and you wouldn't be wrong if you've already guessed that those correspond to the 8 steps of the Eightfold Noble Path that you've read about. We're going to be talking about that more here later today. Here are some more stats. So the largest number of Buddhists proportionately in the world today are in Thailand. As you can see, 95% of the population of Thailand is Buddhist. And then it comes down to 90% in Cambodia, 88% in Myanmar, and so forth and so on. Taiwan, of the countries in Asia, having the least proportionate number of Buddhists. Buddhism, as you know, is one of 2 world religions named after the goal they aspire to, the other being Islam. Buddhism comes from the Sanskrit and Pali word Buddha, which means one who's awakened, somebody who has woken up. And so obviously the goal or the ideal is to join this person, the Buddha, in his enlightenment, his wakefulness, in his becoming the Buddha. So that's the goal, to wake up. The graphic I give you here, I give it to you simply as a mnemonic device. Somebody sitting up, stretching their arms, sun's coming up through the window, waking up in the morning. But of course, keep in mind, that's not the wakefulness that the Buddhist is seeking. You and I guess we would say, I'm talking to you, you're listening to me, we would say we're awake. But actually, from the Buddhist point of view, we're probably both quite deeply asleep and still immersed in delusion. But the graphic can give you at least a a memory image maybe of what Buddhism is all about. It's about waking up. I've compared Buddhism to Christianity in a couple of ways. I've pointed out that Buddhism and Christianity are both children religions that have parent religions. As I'm sure most of you know, Christianity's parent is Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. The early disciples were Jews. The first converts to Christianity were Jews. Christianity was originally a sect within Judaism before it broke away and became its own religion. Much the same thing is the case historically with Buddhism. The founder of Buddhism, we'll talk about him more momentarily, grew up in a Hindu environment, doing Hindu rituals, believing in Hindu-type things. His early converts to his own path were also Hindus. So Buddhism, like Christianity, a child of a parent tradition. I also said you could think of Buddhism in relation to Hinduism, sort of like within Christianity, the relationship between Protestantism and Catholicism, inasmuch as the Buddha himself was a kind of protester, or you could say a rebel, as it were, against the status quo. Keep in mind, Hinduism is not just what we mean by a religion. It's really a whole culture, a whole social system. We've talked about the castes, the clearly demarcated stages of life that one passes through. I alluded just very briefly when we talked about Hinduism to the fact that mountains and sacred rivers and special places in Hinduism are really also part and parcel of that religious tradition. In any case, the point being, Hinduism is necessarily endemic to a particular place, to a particular culture, to India, and it really can't be repeated as such anywhere else. Well, somebody has said, and this has an important truth to it, Buddhism is sort of Hinduism stripped for export. Take away all the cultural baggage, take away the caste system against which the Buddha protested, and down deep, the essence, as it were, of Hinduism, which is what? Moksha, liberation, a search for spiritual freedom. If that's the essence of Hinduism, that is exportable. And if you take away all the cultural baggage and keep just the essence of spiritual freedom, what you get approximately is Buddhism. So you can sort of think about it that way. Child, parent, rebel, status quo, and then the essence of Hinduism stripped down to bare bones and fitted for missionary export to other parts of the world. I point out on this slide that we're going to need to keep in mind certain important doctrinal commonalities, overlaps with Hinduism. We've talked about reincarnation. Well, Buddhists also believe in reincarnation. We've talked about the law of karma, this spiritual law of cause and effect, and certainly Buddhists tap into that also. Where did it all come from? Well, it came from this particular person. This is the rebel. This is the protester. Siddhartha Gautama is the historical Buddha. Now, in Paths of Return, I just gave you a couple of dates, a date of birth and a date of death. Actually, I should admit here that scholars dispute this. They debate exactly when this man lived. Some say he was born as early as 560 BC. Some say no, later than that, more like 485, his birth BC, and then corresponding death dates. Everybody agrees that he lived to be about 80 years old, so he either died in 480 or in 405 BC. I've described him as the man who had it all and who gave it all up. We've all heard of what we call rags to riches stories, right? People that started off really poor and they made it and they succeeded and they advanced and so forth. They ended up rich. Well, this is a riches to rags story. This is sort of a reverse fairy tale, if you will. Siddhartha, as you know from the reading, was born in the midst of luxury. His father was king. He was a nobleman himself. He was raised in the midst of all of this prestige and power and luxury and so forth. But he decided to renounce it all and gave it all up. And he became, as a result, the Buddha. Now, in blue here, I give you 3 different ways in which Buddhists refer to this founder, their founder sage. He is the Buddha. Though, as I point out in parenthesis, he himself said, and Buddhists agree, he's not the only Buddha who's existed in history. In fact, there were before him countless, thousands, maybe millions of previous enlightened beings who, for their time, for their age, for their civilization, functioned as, well, as alarm clocks, waking people up from their sleep. So he's not the only one, but they do describe him as, definite article, the Buddha. He's also called Shakyamuni. The Shakya part of that word is a reference to his particular family, his lineage, his clan. He was part of the Shakya lineage. And Muni, that part of the word simply means sage, a wise man. So he's the wise man of the Shakya clan, the Shakyamuni. And the third term that's used in reference to Siddhartha Gautama by Buddhists, he's called Tathagata. This is the most, mysterious or curious of the epithets for the Buddha. Tathagata literally means thus gone or thus come, and by extension, someone who's come and who's gone, someone who's arrived, has lived here a while, and mysteriously passed on, you see, from this world to the next. Without leaving a trace almost. Well, he did leave a trace. He left his teaching, his religion behind him. But it's kind of like, I'm dating myself here, but those old Lone Ranger TV shows where this guy would do all these good deeds and then he would disappear at the end and people would go, who was that masked man? He's gone. Well, Tathagata has sort of that connotation as well. The Buddha, from the very beginning, was extraordinary. He was a miracle worker. He was like Jesus Christ, someone who was surrounded by miraculous phenomena, really from day one. In fact, as an infant, according to tradition at least, he'd just been born. He was able to take a few steps. Most of us don't do that. And he was able to speak. And what he said, hardly out of his mother's womb, was, and I quote, "Supreme am I in the world, greatest am I in the world, noblest am I in the world. This is my last birth. Never shall I be reborn." Remember that Hindus, Buddhists too, though they believe in reincarnation, don't want to be reincarnated. They don't want to come back to this world, or any world for that matter. They want to be free. They want to be liberated. They want to be enlightened in the case of the Buddhist. So he apparently, as a little tiny child, already prophesied, as it were, about his own future in these words that he uttered as a little child. I've got a little Buddhist sort of child sitting there to maybe be like the Buddha himself was as a little boy, a little child, an infant, in fact. That's Siddhartha Gautama. Some images here. We've talked a little bit about art and aesthetics. I've said every religion has its own dimension of beauty, and its art and its sculpture and its architecture and its music and so forth. And I'm just trying to give you little tastes of that with each of the religions we've studied. So some images here of the Buddha. This is an Indian statue of the Buddha. He's sitting there, as you can see, in the lotus asana, the lotus posture that we've discussed before with the yogis, sitting there in a very contemplative way with his eyes closed, meditating presumably. Here's a Japanese, again, statue of the Buddha, again sitting in meditation, hands folded in his lap, eyes closed. I don't know whether you can see them down here. Let me find my cursor. Down here at the bottom of this image, there are some people standing, and they're exactly that tall. So you can see how huge this statue is of the Buddha in Japan. And then another one, just one more example here. This is a Tibetan sculpture of the Buddha. Notice in each case here how long the ears are. There's a symbolism here in Buddhist aesthetics. The big ears, the hanging ear lobes, that signifies acute hearing. And in turn, the Buddha's merciful, compassionate sensitivity to the sufferings of the world. You see, he's listening in. He's aware of our lamentations, our sorrows. He's picking up on all that, and he's sensitive to that, and he's bringing us the relief from our suffering. Down at the bottom, maybe I should mention this too, in front of the Buddha statue, can you see this down here? There's a photograph of the Dalai Lama. You may recognize that face. It's a very famous face. He's been in the news a lot. The Dalai Lama is the spiritual and political head of the Tibetan people. He's sort of like, I guess, the Pope and the President all rolled into one. He himself is believed to be a very high, we call him a bodhisattva. I'll explain that term to you down the road just a bit. A bodhisattva is sort of a cosmic, spiritual being who comes into the world to relieve suffering and help the rest of us. And this man, the Dalai Lama, he's in his 80s now, I believe, is believed to be the incarnation of a bodhisattva named Avalokiteshvara. We'll talk more about that later on. But there he is in front of this Tibetan image of the Buddha, and I can't resist this. One more slide before we go on. Over here on the right, well, there he is again. There's the Dalai Lama, and a bunch of other religious dignitaries are sitting here. And this guy over here standing up, well, that's yours truly. You've not seen me. Well, you've seen a photograph of me, I guess, on Blackboard, but that's actually me at a conference a number of years ago. And I'm struck as I look at that photo by how attentive the Dalai Lama is. I must have been saying something important. I can't imagine what it was at that point. Anyway, there I am with this Dalai Lama. All right, back to our story. Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism. Well, how did he come to be the Buddha? As you know from Paths of Return, there were 4 stages, as it were, in his life. He witnessed 4, as they call them, passing sights, which turned him around, made him realize that he had a mission and that he shouldn't simply rest on his laurels and continue existing in this prestigious and powerful and luxurious state he was in, but go on to do something else. The graphic is helpful, I think, maybe as a mnemonic device. The first thing he saw, number 1, was an old man, so a person bent over with a staff or a cane. The second sight was a sick person lying on the ground, suffering clearly. The third was a corpse, I guess that's a skeleton. And the fourth thing he saw was a wandering ascetic, a sadhu, someone who'd obviously given up everything in order to be intently engaged in the spiritual life. Well, the Buddha said to himself, how did all this happen? Why do people have all these problems? He hadn't seen this before. He didn't realize that people got old or got sick or they died. And he decided to go off, like the sadhu, the ascetic, in search of the truth, to figure out what the problem was, and if possible, to figure out a solution. As you know, the Buddha himself, compared the teaching he offered as a relief to suffering to how doctors, physicians examine, diagnose, provide therapy prescriptions for their patients. Siddhartha said, I teach about suffering and the way to end it. So he was a kind of spiritual doctor or spiritual physician, examining, diagnosing, providing the therapy, and then also prescription. I talked about that. You know about the basics here already from the reading. These steps, examination, diagnosis, therapy, prescription, become what the Buddhist calls the Buddha's 4 noble truths. Number 1, his examination revealed that all life is dukkha, a Pali word meaning, among other things, literally dislocation, like my elbow I described in Paths of Return, but by extension all suffering, sorrow, affliction, anxiety, dissatisfaction, discomfort, anguish, stress, frustration. Everything in life is actually, at bottom, just dukkha, the Buddha said. Even, as I said in Paths of Return, our happy times. If we stop and we think about it, are really candid and sincere with ourselves, even in the midst of happiness, because we know that it won't last, there's a kind of bittersweetness about it. Well, that's the way all life is, the Buddha said. Physical, spiritual, emotional, affliction, anxiety, dissatisfaction that colors everything in the world. Well, what's the problem? Number 2 is the diagnosis of what caused that suffering. And the cause is tanha. Tanha literally in Pali means thirst, by extension desire. As I said in Paths of Return, I rather like the word craving. I think maybe that's the best term, or clinging, acquisitiveness, possessiveness, the desire of the ego, the selfish ego to get stuff for itself, right? Even if it means competing with others and beating them out, getting that last parking place, getting the last brownie or something. That's tanha, that's desire, that's craving. And that's where the dukkha all comes from. Well, so the solution, number 3, the third of the Noble Truths, is the therapy, the doctor's therapy that the Buddhist provides, which is nirodha. Nirodha, I don't think I used this term in the reading, literally means confinement, limitation, boxing something in, and thus, in turn, stopping it from spreading. So by extension, nirodha means stopping, cessation. It can mean interception, relinquishment, or detachment. So nirodha is the cessation of tanha, the confining of this acquisitive power, this egocentric, this selfish desire that we have, boxing it in to the point that it stops. Now, that's easier said than done, isn't it? So now the Buddha finally provided a prescription. How do we do this? How are we going to accomplish this? How are we going to get rid of our tanha? Well, the answer is you need to follow. The prescription is you need to follow a marga, a path, a way, a road, a spiritual path. Here's how the Buddha himself put it. So here we have a scripture from the Buddhist tradition. It's called a sutta. That's a Pali word, which is the same as the Sanskrit word sutra. They mean literally thread, but they have to do with Buddhist texts, sacred texts. This is a text called the Nagara Sutta, where the Buddha himself, Siddhartha, is speaking here in the first person, and he's describing his discovery. I saw an ancient path, an ancient road, marga in Pali, traveled by the rightly awakened ones of former times. Again, I remind you, he's not the first Buddha. He's not the first person to have woken up. He admits there have been other people before him who also discovered the right road to the truth. I followed that path. Following it, I came to, first, direct knowledge of aging and death. So this is Noble Truth 1, the truth of dukkha, the truth of suffering, including aging and sickness and death. Number 2, I discovered direct knowledge of the origination of aging and death. The origination is Noble Truth 2. Where does it all come from? Tanha. Third, direct knowledge of the cessation of aging and death. Well, how do you do that? By nirodha, Noble Truth 3. And then Noble Truth 4, I came to direct knowledge of the path leading to the cessation of aging and death. I found the solution. What is that ancient path? That ancient road traveled by the rightly awakened ones of former times? Well, it's just this. It's a noble eightfold path, 8 steps, which include right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, I went through all of these in some detail in Paths of Return. I'm not going to repeat all that detail here, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a different take on the Eightfold Path. You can actually divide the 8 steps into 3 major groups, one of them having to do with doctrine. So this is the map of things, the big picture of things, and that would include both right view and right intention. The Pali word here is prajna. Prajna is wisdom, literally. The doctrine, the teaching, the big picture is what you get with right view and right intention. The second category that we can put the steps into is ethics. So moral behavior, the things we ought and ought not to do, sila in Sanskrit. By the way, before I go on, the word right in each case, right view, right intention, right speech, and right action, and so forth, is the Pali word samyak, which literally means complete or balanced or harmonious. So you could substitute those words if you'd like to for all of these points. Balanced view, a complete, thorough understanding of speech and action, and so forth. Okay? Before we go on to the next steps, let me be more explicit about what right action entails. I said something about this already, I think, in Paths of Return. Right action for the Buddhist includes 5 precepts or vows. And they are that you ought not to commit murder, no stealing, no lying, no adultery, and to the familiar 4 Western explicit prescriptions, adding no intoxicants, no alcohol, no drugs, and so forth. What I'm trying to do with my elaboration here is to say, okay, if you look back in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible at Exodus 20, 13 through 17, you find, of course, these same first four prohibitions. Thou shalt not commit murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, and then fourthly, no adultery. The Buddhist refines this, I guess you could say, a little bit more. So no murder, by extension, means no violence, no use of violence toward any sentient being, and sentient beings include not just humans, but animals. No stealing, no lying, more precisely, no misuse of language. You can't be an advertising executive if you're a Buddhist, or if you take your Buddhism seriously. Because, I mean, think about it. All advertising is, in fact, using the language in order to convince people they need things they really don't need. So you're misusing the language. You're not exactly lying, maybe, if you say, you deserve a break today on a billboard on the interstate to get people to come by, McDonald's or something. But that's still a misuse of language. Adultery, okay, well, it's not just having, an illicit affair with somebody who's married to somebody else. It's any, they say, exploitation of the passions, any arousing of not only sexual desire, but gluttony, the desire for food. Any exploitation of that is forbidden. And then again, finally, no drugs, no alcohol. That's not something you see specifically, of course, in Christianity or in Judaism. And then down here, I've got a couple of quotations from Matthew. These are from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he also refines the external law. So Matthew 21:22, he says, you've been told, don't murder. But I say to you, anybody who's angry with his brother has already murdered him. So anger itself is forbidden by Christ. You need to work on your anger. You need to get rid of your passion of anger. And then the same with adultery. So Christ says in verses 27 and 28 of the 5th chapter, again, the Sermon on the Mount, you've been told thou shalt not commit adultery, but I tell you, whoever lusts after somebody else in their heart, just imagining, fantasizing, as it were, has really already broken the commandment. And we need to work on that too inwardly. So in that respect, Jesus' refinement is rather like the Buddhists' refinement of these precepts or vows, four of which, again, we're familiar with in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay, back up here. That's right speech and then right action, more precisely described. To continue with the ethical steps of the path, 5 is right livelihood. You need to choose a profession, right, that's in accordance with Buddhist belief. Right effort, I described, also is an aspect of ethics. And then finally, the third category into which we can put these different steps is meditation, contemplation. The Pali word is samadhi. And these would include the last 2 steps of the Eightfold Path, which remind us a lot of what we talked about, I think, with yoga, namely right mindfulness and right concentration. I inserted here in the middle of this slide a quotation from a medieval, very important, very influential Roman Catholic Christian theologian, Thomas Aquinas, because I thought it would be an interesting parallel, or again, an opportunity to compare and contrast Buddhism, in this case, with Christianity. Thomas Aquinas said, and I quote here, those who are more adapted to the active life, so to external action, good deeds, helping the neighbor, etc., can prepare themselves for contemplation in the practice of the active life. And then you might say the ethical life, the moral life. You prepare yourself for contemplation, meditation, by being a good citizen, by being a moral person, by interacting with people in a noble way. To continue the quotation, though, while those who are more adapted to the contemplative life, who have a calling to meditation, contemplation, and so forth, can, and Thomas would say should, take upon themselves the works of the active life as well, so as to become yet more apt for contemplation. So the point of the quotation is simply to say ethics and contemplation, action and meditation go hand in hand. They're two sides of one coin, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, the Christian, but also very much according to the Buddhist teaching of the Buddha himself. Okay, some more information than I gave you in Paths of Return. I'm going to extend a few points here. There are, according to the Buddhist teaching and according to Buddhism, 3 basic marks of existence, they call them. Now, we've talked about the first already. All of life is laced with dukkha, right? With suffering, with dislocation. Even in the happy times, there's this bittersweet dimension. Life is also characterized, according to Buddhism, by anicca. And if you come down here, you'll see that anicca means impermanence in Pali. The point being, things are all the time changing. Nothing stays put. Everything is constantly morphing into something else. It's like that, the river that we described when I talked about Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who said everything flows, you can't step twice right into the same river. Well, the Buddhist agrees. The Buddhist accentuates that, underscores that teaching. Everything is constantly changing. The third mark of existence, I touched on this in Paths of Return, is anatta. That's a Pali word. The Sanskrit equivalent, and I give you that here, anatman, to remind you of the contrast here with Hinduism. Hinduism talked about the importance of discovering our real self, our Atman, the deep capital S self, which is Brahman. The Buddha says, actually, if you strip yourself down, dig down deep in yourself, look inwardly, you'll discover that you actually don't have a self. Anatta, Atman means no self. So actually, life is marked by suffering, impermanence, and an ultimate selflessness. There are no actual selves, no things. Here's the point. Suffering, dukkha, number 1, is a function of, is dependent on, is a result of our ignorance of the fact that nothing stays put, anicca, and that there actually is no abiding self whatsoever. We don't understand that. We're deluded about that. We've forgotten that. We're ignorant of that. And that's why we suffer. If we realized everything's flowing, everything's changing, including what we call ourself, there's nothing permanent about our own self. It's constantly flowing and changing as well. Nothing, to use another language, to use another term here, nothing has svabhava. Nothing really has its own being. Nothing is its own self. Everything that's in us, everything part of us, everything making us up is a temporary borrowing, as it were, from something else. Something is flowing past and through us. We latch onto that, or we try to latch onto that, hang on to that, and that's our problem. It's tanha trying to grip hold of something that actually won't last, that causes us suffering. Tanha, you could say, is a foolish, the Buddhist term would be unskillful, unhelpful attempt to grasp what isn't really there with a hand that doesn't really exist. And because there isn't anything permanently, really, truly, lastingly there, and because you've really got nothing to hang on to it with, that's why you suffer. That's the origin, in fact, of our suffering. The final goal for the Buddhist, as you know from the reading, is what they call nirvana. That's the Sanskrit nibbana, would be the Pali equivalent. Nirvana means literally blowing out, or something that's been blown out, extinguishing or extinguishment. Somebody has said you could also say nirvana means breathing out or exhaling. Now that's extending it. It's not really the literal meaning, but it's as though you went, whew, just sort of relaxed and let everything out. Stop trying to control, stop trying to be in charge. Finally, just let it all go. Whew. Well, when you do that, You've niroded, if I could take niroda and turn that into a verb. You've ceased to try to cling. You've ceased in your tanha. And as a result of that, you experience nirvana. You enter into a state of where things have been blown out. Now again, not literally like a candle flame or like a fire, but it's the passionate, controlling, desiring, and craving of tanha that gets extinguished. And when that goes out, when you go, whew, the result is nirvana, or nibbana in Pali. The question that Christians and Jews and Muslims, and for that matter, I suppose even Hindus might ask at this point is, where's God? I haven't heard anything about God. We've had a whole discussion of this religion of Buddhism. Where's God? Well, like the grasping hand of tanha, the Buddha says God also isn't really there. Or rather, to be more precise, God, supreme reality by whatever name you might call it, neither is nor isn't there. And this is why Buddhists are referred to as theists, in the sense that I've given that term, not that they deny or reject a supreme reality, like a humanist or a skeptic or an agnostic or somebody. They're not rejecting it, but they're just saying, we can't really say anything about it. It's not important. It's not relevant to the questions. Does God exist? Well, then does God not exist? Would you say God both exists and then somehow doesn't exist? Does he neither exist nor not exist? People try to pin the Buddha down, and the Buddha's answer is silence. He doesn't answer their question. They call this the Buddha's noble, or sometimes called his paradoxically thunderous silence. He refused to address questions like that. He called them questions not tending to edification, moot questions. And here's a story that makes this point a little bit clearer, I think. This guy named Malunkyaputta gets all worried about what's going on in reality. Let me read here. On a certain occasion, the Blessed One, that's the Buddha, was dwelling at Savatthi in Jetavana Monastery in Anathapindika's park. Okay. It happened to the Venerable Malunkyaputta, that's a disciple of the Buddha, being in seclusion, plunged in meditation, so he's doing his spiritual practice, a consideration presented itself to his mind. He started thinking, these theories which the Blessed One, the Buddha, has left unelucidated, has set aside and rejected. Okay, the Buddha has not talked about some things, this man says to himself. Among them, whether the world is eternal or not, whether the world is finite or not, whether the soul and the body are identical or not, whether a saint exists after death or not, or both or neither. Those things, those theories, the Buddha has not elucidated, has not made clear. And the fact that he hasn't elucidated them does not please me or suit me. So this guy, Malunkyaputta, goes to the Buddha, puts these issues before him. And here's what the Buddha says. He does speak, in fact, on this occasion. He's not just silent. He speaks and he says, "It is as if, Malunkyaputta, a man had been wounded by an arrow thickly smeared with poison, and his friends and companions, relatives and kinsfolk were to procure for him a physician or surgeon. And the sick man, who's been shot by this arrow, were to say, 'I will not have this arrow taken out of me until I've learned whether the man who wounded me belonged to the warrior caste,' that's the Kshatriyas, 'to the Brahmin caste, to the agricultural caste,' that would be the Vaishya caste in Hinduism, the menial caste, the Shudra. Or again, he were to say, 'I will not have this arrow taken out of me until I've learned the name of the man who wounded me and to what clan he belongs.' Or again, he were to say, 'I'm not going to let you take this poison arrow out until I've learned whether the man who wounded me was tall or short or middle of height. I won't have the arrow taken out until I've learned whether the man who wounded me was black or brown or of a yellow skin. I'm not going to let you take out the poison arrow until I've learned whether the man who wounded me was from this or that village or town or city.' And it goes on at some length. Other possibilities are mentioned here. Now, the Buddha continues. And here's the point. That man would die, Malunkyaputta, without ever having learned all of this. He's been poisoned, after all. He's been shot by an arrow. And he's wasting time asking all these dumb questions. The religious life, the spiritual life, Malunkyaputta, does not depend on the dogma that the world is eternal or not. Either way, there still remains birth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, misery, grief, and despair. That's dukkha, right? Concerning the extinction of which, in this present life, I have prescribed as a physician. The religious life, Malunkyaputta, doesn't depend on the dogma that the world is finite or not. It doesn't depend on whether the soul and the body are identical or not. It doesn't depend on whether the saint exists after death or not. None of that's relevant. Accordingly, Malunkyaputta, bear always in mind what it is that I have not elucidated, what it is that I have elucidated. And what have I elucidated? Misery, dukkha, the origin of misery, tanha, selfish craving, the cessation of misery, nirodha, and the path, the marga, the noble eightfold path leading to the cessation of misery. And why have I explained all of that and nothing else? Because that, and only that, Malunkyaputta, is of profit. Everything else, including God, believe it or not, is a waste of time for the Buddhist. The Buddhist heaven. Here's another quotation from one of the suttas, the Nibbana Sutta, the Nirvana scripture, literally. And I call this Buddhist heaven. We're going to end up with this in one more slide. There's a dimension, says the Buddha, where there's neither earth, nor water, nor fire, nor wind, neither dimension of the infinitude of space, nor dimension of the infinitude of consciousness, nor dimension of nothingness, nor dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, neither this world nor the next world, nor sun nor moon. And there I say, there is neither coming nor going, nor stasis, neither passing away nor arising. It's without stance, without foundation, without mental object. This, just this state, this dimension, is the end of suffering. Well, that's nirvana, that's nibbana, that's heaven. As I said at the end of the written lecture in Paths of Return, a Christian, a Jew or a Muslim too, may well say, come on, that's not very good. How can that be a heaven? Well, as I said, compare that to what St. Paul, in the Christian New Testament, as a Christian apostle himself has to say about heaven. What does he say? Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of a man to conceive. What? Now he does use the word God, I admit, what God hath prepared for them that love him. But the point being, you can accentuate not, nor, neither, neither, nor, neither, no, not, it, and just say to yourself, the point in both cases is, whatever it is, it's beyond our conception right now. It's beyond our imagination right now what the goal is. And better, the Buddha says, to concentrate on the here and now, to deal with our problems, and not spend our time fantasizing about what's coming next. Stick to the practical stuff, the Buddha says. Right now, solve the problem of suffering. That's Buddhism in a nutshell.